Imagine landing on a continent and declaring it empty. No owners, no laws, no people, just wilderness waiting to be tamed. That's exactly what the British did in 1788. They called it Terra Nullius, Latin for land belonging to no one. With that legal fiction, they justified claiming an entire continent without a treaty, without negotiation, without even asking. But here's the truth they refused to see. Australia wasn't empty. It was one of the most carefully managed landscapes on Earth, shaped, cultivated, and sustained by the world's oldest continuous civilization for at least 65,000 years. This isn't a story about primitive hunters stumbling through the bush. This is about sophisticated land managers who transformed an entire continent into what one historian called the biggest estate on Earth. Before 1788, Aboriginal Australians didn't just live on the land, they engineered it. And when the British arrived, they destroyed a system they never understood. This is who really owned Australia. Let's start with a number that should blow your mind. 65,000 years. That's how long Aboriginal Australians have lived on the continent. For context, that's 60,000 years before the pyramids of Egypt, 50,000 years. Before agriculture was invented in the Middle East, longer than modern humans have lived anywhere else outside Africa. In 2017, archaeologists working at Budj Bim rock shelter in Arnhem Land in northern Australia discovered stone tools, grinding stones, and ochre pigments buried in sediment layers. And radiocarbon dating confirmed they were at least 65,000 years old, the oldest evidence of human habitation outside Africa. Aboriginal people themselves have always known this. The Dreamtime, their spiritual and cosmological framework, tells them they've been here since the time of creation, when ancestral beings shaped the land, gave life to people, and established the laws that govern relationships between humans, animals, plants, and country. Country is a critical concept. It's not just land in the Western sense, it's a living, breathing entity. Country includes land, water, sky, plants, animals, and the spiritual connections between them. You don't own country, you belong to it. You're responsible for it. When the first humans arrived, likely crossing from Southeast Asia during the Ice Age when sea levels were much lower, they faced one of the most challenging migrations in human history. Even with lower sea levels, they still had to cross at least 90 kilometers of open ocean to reach Australia. This required sophisticated seafaring technology, boats, navigation skills, and planning far beyond what we typically associate with Stone Age people. Once they arrived, they spread across the continent with astonishing speed. By 50,000 years ago, Aboriginal people had reached every corner of Australia, from the tropical north to the freezing highlands of Tasmania, which was still connected to the mainland. They adapted to rainforests, deserts, mountains, and coastlines, developing over 250 distinct language groups and 500 dialects, each with their own territories, laws, and relationships to country. By 1788, when the British First Fleet arrived, there were an estimated 300,000 to 1 million Aboriginal people living across Australia. They weren't a single culture. They were hundreds of distinct nations, each with complex social structures, trade networks, and land management systems. And they had transformed the continent. Here's where it gets fascinating. For tens of thousands of years, Aboriginal Australians used fire as their most powerful tool. Not accidental fires, not destructive wildfires, controlled, deliberate, strategic burning, to shape the landscape exactly how they wanted it. This practice is called fire stick farming, a term coined by Australian archaeologist Rhys Jones in 1969. But Aboriginal people have always just called it taking care of country. Here's how it worked. Aboriginal fire practitioners would conduct cool burns, small-scale, low-intensity fires lit during the early dry season when conditions were mild. These fires would clear undergrowth without destroying the canopy, promote new grass growth, which attracted grazing animals like kangaroos and wallabies, reduce fuel loads, preventing catastrophic wildfires later, create a patchwork mosaic of different vegetation stages across the landscape. This wasn't random. It was a sophisticated land management system practiced continent-wide for thousands of years. When early European explorers like Captain James Cook and the first fleet officers arrived in 1788, they described Australia as looking like gentlemen's parks in England, open grasslands dotted with trees, manicured and park-like. They thought it was natural. It wasn't. It was cultivated. Aboriginal fire management created open eucalyptus forests with grassy understories, perfect for kangaroo hunting, productive wetlands for fishing, abundant yam daisy fields, a staple food, controlled savanna landscapes that prevented megafires. Historian Bill Gamage, in his groundbreaking book, The Biggest Estate on Earth, 2011, argues that the entire Australian continent was a single managed estate in 1788, albeit with many managers. Every patch of land had custodians responsible for maintaining it. Aboriginal people didn't just take resources from the land, they actively shaped ecosystems to make plants and animals abundant, convenient, and predictable. They distributed plant species in specific patterns. They created fire mosaics that encouraged biodiversity. They managed succession stages to maximize productivity. This is agriculture. It's just not the kind Europeans recognized. Fire wasn't the only tool. Aboriginal Australians built some of the most sophisticated pre-industrial infrastructure in the world. In southwest Victoria, the Budj Bim cultural landscape contains a network of stone channels, weirs, and fish traps that are at least 6,600 years old, older than the pyramids. The Gunditjmara people engineered an elaborate aquaculture system that diverted water from volcanic crater lakes, created artificial ponds to farm eels, stored and smoked surplus catch for year-round food security. This wasn't opportunistic fishing, this was deliberate food production. The Budj Bim system supported permanent villages, something historians once claimed Aboriginal Australians never built. In the semi-arid interior, Aboriginal people harvested native grains like native millet and panicum. Archaeologists have found grinding stones dating back 30,000 years, evidence of grain processing. Early European explorers witnessed Aboriginal people harvesting seeds with woven baskets, grinding grain into flour, baking bread, damper, storing surplus grain in woven containers or underground caches. In his book Dark Emu, 2014, Bruce Pascoe documents dozens of European accounts describing Aboriginal agriculture, fields of yam daisies, grain harvests, irrigation channels, and food storage. While some historians debate Pascoe's interpretations, even his critics accept that Aboriginal land use was far more complex than once believed. Aboriginal Australia wasn't isolated groups wandering the bush. It was a continent-spanning trade network. Items traveled thousands of kilometers. Ochre from specific sacred sites, used for ceremonies and art. Pearl shells from the northwest coast, traded to Central Australia. Stone tools from quarries in Victoria, distributed across the southeast. Bowler shells from Cape York, found in South Australia. These trade routes followed superhighways, paths that modern highways still follow today. Aboriginal people maintained these routes with controlled burning and regular travel, creating predictable corridors across the continent. By 1788, Aboriginal Australia was home to hundreds of distinct nations. Each nation had defined territories with recognized boundaries, not fences, but understood borders, complex kinship systems that regulated marriage, inheritance, and social obligations, legal frameworks governing resource use, dispute resolution, and intergroup relations. Spiritual connections linking people, ancestors, land, and law population estimates vary wildly, from 300,000 to over 1 million people. The southeast and coastal regions were densely populated. Permanent villages existed along the Murray River and in resource-rich areas like Victoria's Western District. Aboriginal societies weren't anarchic. They had governance structures based on elders who held deep knowledge and made decisions, lawmen and women who enforced cultural laws, councils that mediated disputes between groups. These weren't hierarchical like European kingdoms, but they were highly organized. Everyone knew their responsibilities. Everyone had roles. This doesn't mean Aboriginal societies were perfect or conflict-free. Like all human societies, they had disputes, violence, and hardship. But complexity doesn't disappear just because a culture looks different from Europe. By 1788, Aboriginal Australians had developed boomerangs, some designs returning, some for hunting, woomeras, spear throwers that tripled throwing distance, fish traps, nets and weirs, bark canoes and rafts for river and coastal travel ground edge axes. The world's oldest example was found in Australia, dating to 49,000 years ago. Grindstones for processing seeds, complex weaving techniques for nets, baskets, and containers. This wasn't primitive. This was a civilization perfectly adapted to its environment. On January 26, 1788, the British First Fleet arrived at Sydney Cove. Governor Arthur Phillip was instructed to open an intercourse with the natives and to conciliate their affections, enjoining all our subjects to live in amity and kindness with them. That lasted about a week. The Eora people, the traditional custodians of Sydney, were at first surprised, then alarmed, then hostile. The British were taking their land, their water, and their resources without asking permission. A profound violation in Aboriginal culture. In Aboriginal law, you can't just walk onto someone else's country and start using it. You have to ask. You have to be invited. You have to follow protocols. The British didn't care. They believed Australia was Terra Nullius, land belonging to no one. In their eyes, Aboriginal people were too primitive to have property rights. They didn't farm, according to European definitions. They didn't build permanent structures. They did, but the British ignored this. They didn't have written laws. They had oral law, infinitely more complex. So the British simply declared the land Crown property and started claiming it. Within months, smallpox swept through Aboriginal communities around Sydney. Over 50% of the Eora population died. The disease spread inland, devastating nations that had never even seen a European. Smallpox, influenza, measles, and other introduced diseases would kill tens of thousands over the following decades. Aboriginal people had no immunity, Entire communities were wiped out. As British settlers pushed inland, they encountered resistance. Aboriginal people defended their country. They used guerrilla tactics, ambushes, spearing, fire. The British responded with overwhelming violence. Frontier massacres became routine. Men, women, and children were shot, poisoned, or driven off cliffs. Between 1788 and 1930, researchers estimate at least 8,270 Aboriginal people were killed in frontier massacres, documented by the University of Newcastle's Colonial Frontier Massacres Project. Some estimates place total Aboriginal deaths from conflict at 17,000 to 30,000 horse. Estimates vary widely because many killings were never recorded. Settler deaths, around 700 to 3,000. This was a war, undeclared but brutal. The British didn't just kill Aboriginal people, they destroyed the land management systems that had sustained Australia for 65,000 years. Here's the part that changes everything. If Aboriginal people hadn't been removed from their land, Australia might be less flammable today. British settlers had a fear of fire. In Europe, fire meant destruction. So they banned Aboriginal burning, without regular, cool burns. Undergrowth grew unchecked, fuel loads accumulated, forests became dense and flammable, catastrophic wildfires became common. The first major bushfire disaster came in 1851, the Black Thursday fires, which burned 5 million hectares in Victoria. This was 63 years after colonization. For 65,000 years before that, Aboriginal fire management had prevented such catastrophes. Settlers cleared millions of hectares for sheep, cattle, and crops. They fenced off land, destroying Aboriginal movement and access to country, introduced invasive species, rabbits, foxes, cats, which devastated native animals, drained wetlands, dammed rivers, cut down forests. The carefully balanced ecosystems Aboriginal people had maintained collapsed. As Aboriginal people were killed, dispossessed, and forcibly removed from their land, millennia of ecological knowledge was lost. Languages died. Elders who held the knowledge passed away without being able to pass it on. Young people were taken from their families. The Stolen Generations policy lasted from the 1910s to the 1970s, and forbidden to speak their languages or practice their culture. By the mid-20th century, much of this knowledge seemed lost forever. For over 200 years, Australia was legally based on a lie. Terra Nullius, the British claimed Australia was uninhabited, or too primitive to have property rights. Therefore, they owed Aboriginal people nothing. No treaties, no compensation, no recognition. This wasn't just immoral, it was factually wrong. Aboriginal people clearly had complex land tenure systems, defined territories, governance structures, sustainable land use. But British law didn't care. Aboriginal people were British subjects after 1788, but had no property rights in their own country. Everything changed on June 3, 1992. The High Court of Australia ruled in Mabo v. Queensland, No. 2, that Terra Nullius was invalid. Native title had existed continuously since before 1788. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people could claim native title to land where they could prove continuous connection. This was a legal earthquake. For the first time, Australia acknowledged that Aboriginal people had owned the land before British colonization. Eddie Mabo, a Meriam man from the Torres Strait, had fought for years to prove his people's connection to their land. He died months before the ruling, never knowing he'd won. By 2021, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people held exclusive or shared title to about 54% of the Australian landmass. But this isn't giving land back. It's recognizing what was always there. Native title is also limited. It can be extinguished by government action. It doesn't grant full ownership in the way freehold title does. And it only applies where continuous connection can be proven, which is nearly impossible in areas where Aboriginal people were killed or forcibly removed. In recent decades, something remarkable has happened. The revival of Aboriginal land management. Aboriginal fire practitioners, elders who never stopped caring for country in remote areas, have begun teaching the next generation. Organizations like the Fire Sticks Alliance are training Indigenous rangers and working with government agencies to reintroduce cultural burning. Australia's bushfire problem has gotten worse since 1788. The 2019 to 2020 Black Summer fires burned over 18 million hectares, killed 33 people, destroyed 3,000 homes, and killed an estimated 3 billion animals. Experts increasingly agree Aboriginal fire management could have prevented this. Studies show that in northern Australia, where Aboriginal rangers have reintroduced traditional burning, wildfire area has decreased by 40%, carbon emissions from fires have dropped significantly, biodiversity has increased. The science backs up what Aboriginal people have been saying for centuries. Their way works. Across Australia, Aboriginal communities are reclaiming traditional languages, many brought back from the brink of extinction, reviving cultural practices, training young people as rangers, working with scientists to document traditional ecological knowledge. This isn't nostalgia. This is survival. In the face of climate change, Aboriginal knowledge offers proven strategies for managing fire, water, and ecosystems. So, who really owned Australia before 1788? The answer is obvious: Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. They didn't just live here. They shaped the entire continent into a productive, biodiverse, sustainable landscape. They developed complex societies, trade networks, and governance systems. They managed ecosystems with precision and care. And they maintained this for 65,000 years, the longest continuous civilization in human history. When the British arrived, they saw what they wanted to see: empty land ripe for taking. They ignored the evidence in front of them: the managed landscapes, the villages, the fish traps, the grain harvests. They declared Terra Nullius and built a nation on a legal fiction. That fiction has been overturned. Native title is now recognized. But the damage done to people, to culture, to country can never be fully repaired. 750,000 people lived here in 1788. By 1900, fewer than 100,000 remained. Languages were lost, knowledge was lost, lives were lost. But Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people survived. They're still here. They're still connected to country. They're still the oldest living culture on Earth. And their knowledge, especially about fire, water, and land, is more relevant now than ever. Australia wasn't empty in 1788. It was full of life, full of knowledge, full of people who had cared for this land longer than anyone else on Earth. The British couldn't see it, or they chose not to. But the land remembers, the trees remember, the rivers remember, and Aboriginal people remember. This is their country. It always was. It always will be. If you learned something from this video, hit that like button and subscribe. Now, here's the real question. Do you think Australia was discovered or invaded? Drop your answer below. I'll pin the best arguments from both sides. Thanks for watching.